Okay, we're now ready to continue our study of Revelation where we left off. We're ready now to consider Roman numeral 9, the woman clothed with the sun. She appears in Revelation 12, verses 1 and 2. Now, as we enter Revelation chapter 12, we enter in between two major series. The trumpets have completed in Revelation 11, verse 15 and following, and the bowls are coming, but they await Revelation chapter 16, verse 1 and following. Therefore, Revelation chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15 are a large section of material given before the bowls are actually poured out upon Israel. So let us begin with a consideration first, capital A, the woman described. Verse 1 says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, and she was with child. And she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth." Well, who is this woman? Why does she appear here? What's going on? Well, as is always the case in the book of Revelation, there is much debate over this identity. However, I believe that this represents Israel ideally conceived, Israel idealized. Notice that the Messiah is born from her. In verse 5 it says, "She," that this woman, "gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne." Now let's give the evidence that this is Israel ideally conceived, Old Covenant Israel in her ideal setting. In the first place, John's general imagery source. As always, we must remember John makes abundant use of the Old Testament and its imagery, and therefore we should expect some kind of backdrop here within the Old Testament to help us to interpret this. Well, the Old Testament prophets constantly speak of Israel as if she were a woman. In Ezekiel 16, for instance, God tells of finding her on the side of the road and marrying her. That is, he found her in Egypt in grievous circumstances. The Old Testament presents her in ideal glory, as does Revelation. Let's read Ezekiel 16, verses 12 through 13. "I put a ring in your nostril, earrings in your ears, and a beautiful crown on your head. Thus you were adorned with gold and silver, and your dress was of fine linen, silk, and embroidered cloth. You ate fine flour, honey, and oil, so you were exceedingly beautiful and advanced to royalty." Now, literally, Israel wasn't given a ring in her nose and earrings and things of that sort. This is an ideal conception of her, how that God took her in and he blessed her. And we can see this in many other references in Scripture showing an ideal conception of Israel in Isaiah 49:18, 52 verses 1 and 2, Zechariah 2:10, and other passages that speak similarly of Israel as she is ideally covenantally conceived. But number two, John's particular imagery source. John is particularly reflecting on Zion's travail that is found in Isaiah 66, verses 7 through 9. In Isaiah 66, verse 7, we read these words, "Before she travailed, she brought forth. Before her pain came, she gave birth to a boy." And so here in Revelation 12, this ideal woman, ideal Israel, gives birth to a son, Jesus Christ, which is reflecting what is said of Zion in Isaiah 66, verse 7. And later we'll see ideal Israel bearing other children. In Revelation 12:17, just a few verses later, we read that the devil goes after the rest of her children. Now this woman gave birth to Christ, but now there's mention of the rest of her children. And thus what we have going on in Revelation 12:17 is picking up also on Isaiah 66. Isaiah 66:7 says she gave birth to a boy. Isaiah 66 verse 8 said, "As soon as Zion travailed, she also brought forth her sons." So this is the immediate backdrop, the particular imagery source that John is reflecting on when he writes this part of Revelation. Let's consider John's specific presentation here as our third point. The 12 stars, the crown of 12 stars on her head in verse 1, represent the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes have already been mentioned in Revelation chapter 7, verses 4 and following. And later, the New Covenant Church, which displaces Old Covenant Israel, will be united with this ideal conception of Israel, the elect of Israel of old, and Israel as she should have been. And the 12 tribes will appear as a part of the foundation of the New Jerusalem bride associated with the 12 apostles. In Revelation 21, verses 12 and 14, we read these words, which again we'll get to more specifically when we're in that section of Revelation. We read there, "It had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and at the 12 gates 12 angels, and the names were written on them, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel." Verse 14 goes on to say, "And the wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb." So you see, the 12 apostles of the Lamb are united ideally with the 12 tribes of Israel in this new Jerusalem. It cannot be the Jerusalem that rejected Christ. It's the ideal Jerusalem, conceived as a woman in terms of John's dramatic imagery here in the book. So here, John is presenting Old Covenant Israel, the elect of Israel, in her ideal form. He's painting a glorious picture here. And this is Israel in principle. It is Israel as God intended her to be. It's not what Israel has become in history and is being judged for now. Fourthly, therefore we must consider John's contextual point. Remember his theme, Revelation 1:7. I know you know it by now, but the theme we must always keep in mind is he's coming in judgment against the tribes of the land who pierced him. He's coming in judgment against Israel for rejecting him. Yet, we find that the Messiah was, as a matter of fact, historically born from within Old Covenant Israel. Hence her glory. Though she has failed, God has secured her seed, the seed of the covenant, Christ himself, through her over the years. And this is important for Revelation's theme because present Israel has become a synagogue of Satan, has become an Egypt. And so John is going to show that even though Israel has failed historically, God has preserved a remnant, and through Israel, ideally conceived, has brought forth Christ, the Messiah. John sums up Christ's ministry, not by going over a lot of details regarding his life here on the earth, but he sums up Christ's life on the earth from its beginning to its end. He speaks of his being born, entering the world, and his ascension when he exited the world. So he kind of capsulizes the whole life of Christ, the incarnation of Christ, from his birth to his ascension. And so obviously, and that's in verse 5, by the way, so obviously this material that he's giving us now is in the past. Though most of Revelation regards the future, even though it's soon to come to pass, here he has to back up and reflect on some past events. One of the major commentators on Revelation today, F.D. Matsuferi, has observed, quote, "In Revelation 12, he even steps back in time to provide an adequate background." You see, he's laying down foundations here from the story of redemptive history. Most of the time he reflects the Old Testament, but now he's looking at what's happened in New Testament times in the coming of Christ. This is important for providing historical context, redemptive historical context. Now, the Messiah, hated by Israel and crucified by her, actually came from her and to her, even though she rejects him. This reminds us of John 1:11. He came to his own, and those who were his own received him not. But ideal Israel is not to totally vanish. Although Israel is judged, the temple goes away forever. Ideal Israel continues on in the remnant of Israel that gives rise to Christianity, the Jewish church where the first Christians were converted. They are the remnant of Israel that gives rise to the Christian faith. And we'll see more of this in verses 13 and following when we get to that point. Now, capital B, the red dragon. Look at Revelation 12, verses 3 and following. "Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them down to the earth, to the land, we'll note. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. You see, the stars were swept down to the land where the dragon's going to be standing to destroy Jesus when he's born. Well, let's look at this in a little more careful way. First, the dragon's identity. I don't think anybody disputes this identification, but clearly here the dragon represents Satan. In Revelation 12:9 it says, "The great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan." So that's really indisputable as the interpretation. Secondly, the dragon's appearance. His color is red, and therefore he represents bloodshed. Satan, according to Christ in John 8:44, was a murderer from the beginning. He caused the first murder, and he was a murderer from the beginning. He is the one behind Israel and Rome persecuting Christianity. And so now we must deal with the dragon who's behind all of this torment for the Christians in the first century. And notice also his heads and his horns. He has 7 heads. 7 is a number of qualitative completion. And the 10 horns are a number of a quantitative perfection. So he has these 7 heads and 10 horns, which speak of his great power. And this will link him with the 7-headed beast of Rome, because the 7-headed beast of Rome is going to reflect his father, the dragon Satan, by reflecting the dragon's 7 heads as well. We'll get to that in Revelation 13, verses 1 and 2. Now thirdly, Satan seeks to destroy Christ. Look at chapter 12, verse 4, latter part of verse 4. "The dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne." Again, this has moved us back in time. It's regarding the period of Christ's incarnation here upon the earth. Satan is the one who caused Herod to try to kill Christ and kill the children in Bethlehem. See, the devil is standing before the woman wanting to kill her child when he's born. So we have there an allusion to Herod's destruction of the children and trying to kill Christ. And then we should remember, of course, Christ's temptation, where he's off in the wilderness and Satan comes to tempt him. And we should remember that also when Christ was betrayed by Judas, one of Jesus' own disciples, that the scriptures tell us that Satan entered him to betray Christ. But Satan fails, and Christ is caught up to the throne. That's the real quick message here, that even Satan tries to destroy Christ and fails. He is at the throne. The Christ that you worship, Christians, he is the one who has conquered Satan and has risen to heaven. Well, now this brings us to capital C, the war in heaven. In chapter 12, verses 7 and 9, we read these words. "There was a war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon." Verse 9. "And the great dragon was thrown down." Let's notice first, this is not a literal battle. Can we imagine heaven being racked with battles, that actually something's going on in heaven where God is having to fight for his own throne room? Well, surely not. This is a symbolic book, and so this is a symbolic battle. Secondly, this is symbolic of a spiritual reality. And this spiritual reality is the overthrowing of Satan's authority in the world. Notice the judicial imagery that is swept into this image here. This battle occurs at the throne of God, Revelation 12:5, and it's in a judicial drama, the whole book of Revelation, and the heavenly pronouncement points to the battle's legal, judicial nature. In Revelation 12:10, he says, "The accuser," there's a term for court accusation, "the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them before our God day and night." You see, throughout history, Satan has brought accusation against the saints. In Job 1:6 and Job 2:1 and Zechariah 3:1, we see Old Testament evidence of Satan appearing before God to bring accusations against Job and others. Now, John also adds another point in his identification of the dragon. He says he's called the devil and Satan in verse 9. The word devil and Satan, one's a Greek word and one's a Hebrew word, they indicate slander or adversary. So again, there are legal implications here. Revelation is a forensic drama dealing with the judicial conquest of the enemies of God's people through the activity of heaven. John adds still more to the identification when he says in verse 9, he deceives the whole world. Not only does Satan persecute God's true people, but in the past he has blinded the nations of men that they not know who the true God is and serve him. But with the coming of Christ and the gospel, this is all going to be ending. The world is being opened. And as AD 70 leads to the conquering of Israel, who was the first persecutor of the Christian church, we have the securing of Christianity for the long run, so the gospel can continue to go out into all the world. The vision's point is that the main enemy behind all opposition, whether it be Jews or Romans or whatever, the main enemy coordinating all the opposition against Christianity, he himself has been vanquished. And Christ's victory over Satan was legally effected at his resurrection. In Colossians 2:15 we read Paul saying, he disarmed the rulers and authorities, making a public display of them. And the context there shows it's clearly at the resurrection. But though Satan is legally vanquished there, we have in Revelation John associating his public demonstration with the conquest of Israel in AD 70. So even though Christ accomplishes the task during his own ministry when he's resurrected from the dead, we have the public demonstration here, and John is linking things up with the AD 70 judgment of Israel, because Israel is opposed to God and opposed to Christ and is opposed to the people of God, and she must be judged in order to affirm and to vindicate the martyrs. Thirdly, the identity of Michael. Most think that this speaks of an angel named Michael. And actually, I believe that it refers to Christ under the imagery of Michael the archangel. Consider these evidences. In the first place, Scripture expects Satan's defeat to be performed by Christ. In Genesis 3:15, we have the seed of the woman conquering the seed of the serpent. The seed of the woman is Christ. And so we should expect that Christ is the one who conquers Satan, as is being done here in Revelation chapter 12, just because of the whole flow of redemptive history beginning in the Garden of Eden. Secondly, Michael first appears in the Bible as a Christophany himself. He's a manifestation of Christ, because in Daniel 10:13, 21, and 12:1, we have Daniel presenting Michael as the defender of God's people, like the angel of the Lord. He's the angel of the Lord. In the New Testament, Christ is the head of his church and the defender of his church. Michael is Christ, ultimately. And furthermore, in Jude 9, Michael is called an archangel. And that means a ruling or head of the angels. Well, this reminds us of the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, who's called the captain of the host of the Lord in Joshua 5:14. We know that that's a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. The angel of the Lord is Christ. He is the captain of the Lord's host, not some subordinate angel, but Christ himself. That's why we read in the New Testament that Christ has his own angels, Matthew 13:41, 16:27, and 24:31. Furthermore, New Testament theology favors Christ casting down Satan. We may read many references regarding Christ's victory over Satan in Matthew 12:22 through 29, Colossians 2:15, which I read just a moment ago, Hebrews 2:14 and 15, and other passages. Jesus is the one who conquers Satan. Therefore, in this book, speaking of the defeat of Satan, we would expect Jesus to be the one who conquers Satan. And Jesus appears here under the imagery of Michael. Furthermore, Revelation is the first introduction of Satan's demise. Why would that task be given over to an angel rather than being accomplished by Jesus himself? And then finally, the heavenly hymn acknowledges Christ is the victor. Look at Revelation 12:10, the latter part. Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. That is, as Satan's thrown down, we see the authority of Christ. So we would expect that Christ is the one that threw down Satan because of this and all the other various evidences we have. Well, let's consider now, capital D, the dragon's fall. First, let's notice the result of the war. Satan is thrown down to the earth, that is, to the land. Revelation 12, verse 9. In Revelation 9:11, we saw an upsurge of demonic activity. And as that trumpet was sounded and the demons flood out into Israel during the Jewish war, which causes some horrendous immoralities to occur. Christ warned specifically in his ministry of a worsening demon problem for Israel. In Matthew 12, verse 45, he says, the demons will be 7 times worse in this generation after I leave. And so the result of the war is Satan is thrown down into the land, and this is what we would expect because of earlier in Revelation 9 and Matthew 12, this has been prophesied already. Secondly, Satan's fall brings woes for a short time. Revelation 12, verse 12 says, woe to the earth, and by that we mean the land, woe to the land and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. Satan is thrown down into Israel, and that Christians are being persecuted from the ascension to AD 70. He's been thrown down. The Christians are being persecuted, but Satan's fall is a sure sign of the victory of Christ over him. Revelation 12:10 says, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. Now thirdly, Satan attempts to destroy the Jerusalem church. He failed in conquering Christ, killing him at his birth, killing him at his crucifixion, and every other context in which he tried to kill him. Christ was resurrected. He ascended into heaven. But now he turns to destroy the other children of the ideal woman, Old Covenant Israel, ideally conceived. In Revelation 12:13 we read, when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, that is the land, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. So now, after having tried to kill Christ, he's turning his attention to the servants of Christ, the other children of ideal Israel, and is going to persecute the church. But, number 4, God providentially protects the members of the Jerusalem church. Remember, all this casting down is thrown into the land, and it's especially focusing in upon Jerusalem. Revelation 12, verses 14 and 16 says, but the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time, from the presence of the serpent. Verse 16, but the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the water, the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. Now the imagery here is of the dragon vomiting out a river to try to flood the area, to try to destroy the other children of ideal Israel, that is, the church at Jerusalem. This flood probably represents the Roman armies and auxiliary troops flooding into the land of Israel, pouring into Israel. But it says the earth, that is the land, opens her mouth and drinks up the water so that the church is spared. Well, this appears to be saying, ironically, that as the Romans come into Israel, the promised land, that the land itself is absorbing the brunt of Satan's rage, so that the Jews and the temple are destroyed and the Christians actually escape. And fifthly, Satan then turns his attention to Christians beyond the Jerusalem church. In chapter 12, verse 17, we read, so the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Now this is introducing us to what is going to transpire in Revelation 13 when the Roman beast turns its power against Christianity and tries to destroy the Christians. But before we get there, and before we conclude this message at this time, let's notice capital E, a problem answered. Revelation 13 deals with the Roman persecution. This begins in AD 64 under Nero. When John presents the Jewish war that erupts in AD 67, we have a problem, because he's been dealing with the Jewish war which began in 67, but now at this point he's going to be dealing with the Neronic persecution which began earlier in 64. How do we reconcile this apparent anachronism? Well, first, we must realize that vision sequence does not imply chronological sequence. We have just narrated the birth of Christ and his ascension, which is anachronistic, no matter what interpretation of Revelation you have, whether it was most of it's dealing with AD 70 or most of it at the end of history. The fact is Revelation 12 backs up and gives the birth and ascension of Jesus Christ. So there is that anachronism there. And so we must understand that vision sequence does not relate to historical chronological sequence. Furthermore, secondly, it is common for the prophets of the Old Testament, remember that's what John is mimicking, it is common for prophets of the Old Testament to deal first with Israel and only then the nations, because they're the covenant people. This happens over and over again, that the prophet will come to Israel and condemn her, and then will deal with the other nations. And so there's a covenantal reason for this, the priority of Israel in the covenantal arrangement. And thirdly, Jewish opposition actually begins earlier in the book of Acts. And so the Roman persecution erupts in 64, but from the time of Pentecost and thereafter in 30 AD, we already have the Jews actually persecuting the Christians, so that the Israelite problem there already arises much earlier anyway. And fourthly, the Jewish opposition to Christianity causes Rome to persecute Christianity. And Christ even warned of this. In Matthew 10, 17 and 18, he says, "Beware of men, for they would deliver you to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues." He's talking about Jewish synagogues. "And you shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles." You see, he's talking about the Jews are the ones who cause your trouble and cause you to be brought before the Gentiles. Now, if we had time to do a study of it, it's a fascinating study, but we can demonstrate historically that the Jews were the ones who prompted Nero to persecute the Christians through one of Nero's wives, who was a Jewish, was aligned with Judaism in some way. She wasn't a full convert to Judaism, but she was a Jewish sympathizer, and we could demonstrate that if we had the time. Then the Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible, we read these words: "New Testament persecution as a whole began with the Jews' attack upon the church. But before long, they sought the assistance of Gentiles, especially the Roman authorities." So we see that even though there's a dischronology here, where we deal with the Jewish war, which starts in 67, and then the Roman persecution, which starts in 64, the fact is that the Jews were the ones that caused the Romans to instigate that. Hence, John puts the Jewish issue first, because that's the main fulfillment of his prophetic witness here in Revelation. So now we're all set. We're ready to begin Revelation 13 regarding the beast that arises from the sea, which we will do in our next lecture.